Hey everyone, tonight we're diving deep into a chilling chapter of history. Not about kings or battles, but about survival itself. The Little Ice Age plunged much of the world into bitter cold winters that crushed crops, froze rivers, and brought entire communities to the brink of collapse. Imagine facing months of darkness, hunger, and freezing cold with nothing but grit to keep you alive. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you really enjoy this kind of deep dive. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our global community come together. Now get cozy, maybe grab a blanket, and let's step back into a winter you wouldn't survive. The River Thames froze solid and turned into a survival market. The winter of 1683 to 1684 was unlike any other in the memory of Londoners. A brutal, relentless cold that transformed the city in ways few could have imagined. For weeks, temperatures plunged to record lows, so severe that the River Thames, the lifeblood of London and a bustling artery of trade and travel, froze solid. This wasn't a thin crust of ice that might form on a pond. The Thames was encased in a thick, unyielding layer of ice that stretched from bank to bank, firm enough to support the weight of thousands of people walking across it. The very heart of England's capital became a frozen highway, a strange, surreal spectacle that seemed to defy the natural order. The freezing of the Thames was a physical manifestation of a climate so harsh it gripped the city in an icy vice and altered daily life for months on end. To understand the gravity of this event, we must first consider the context of 17th century London. This was a city already teetering on the edge of survival for its poorest inhabitants. Rapid urban growth had created cramped living conditions with narrow alleys and dilapidated housing, providing little shelter against the elements. Food supplies, reliant on transportation by river and road, were precarious even in mild seasons. Now, with the Thames frozen solid, this vital supply chain was shattered overnight. The frozen river, while a marvel for the masses who ventured out onto its surface, was the beginning of a nightmare. Markets that once bustled along the riverbanks were forced to close, boats were trapped beneath the ice, and deliveries of grain, vegetables, and fresh meat ground to a halt. The rich, with their stored reserves and access to alternative sources, could weather the storm with discomfort, but little threat to their survival. The poor, however, faced an escalating crisis of hunger and desperation. As weeks passed, the cold deepened its cruel grip. Fires burned low in hearths as coal became scarce and costly. Clothes, already threadbare for many, were layered on, but the bitter chill seeped through every gap. Hunger gnawed relentlessly. The city's workhouses and charity organizations were overwhelmed, their meager resources quickly depleted. Bread, the staple of survival, grew scarcer and more expensive. Rumors began to spread through the shivering streets of people resorting to unimaginable acts to stave off starvation. Survival instincts took hold in grim and disturbing ways. Reports emerged of individuals scavenging for food in the most desperate places. Rat infestations in sewers and abandoned buildings suddenly became unintended food sources. The rats, once a nuisance, became a grim symbol of survival, hunted in the shadows by the starving. In some districts, the line between life and death blurred as people ate spoiled or rotting meat, taking the risk of sickness just to quiet the gnawing hunger. In a city gripped by cold and famine, the human spirit was tested to its limits. The frozen Thames itself became a marketplace, not for goods, but for survival. Vendors and desperate souls alike set up stalls on the ice, selling what little they could find, scraps of food, firewood, and even pieces of clothing. The river, which once carried the goods of commerce, now bore the weight of human desperation and barter. People sold their last possessions, including their clothes and household items, to buy bread and fuel for warmth. This trade on ice was as surreal as it was heartbreaking, a stark reminder of how the freeze had upended normal life. The phenomenon of the Thames freezing solid was not unprecedented, but had become increasingly rare by the late 17th century. This was due to the gradual warming of the climate known today as the end of the Little Ice Age. However, this particular winter was exceptional. The thick ice also allowed for the famous frost fairs to be held, temporary festivals on the river, complete with food stalls, games, and even jousting tournaments. These events, while celebratory and bizarre, could not mask the underlying suffering endured by many Londoners during this cruel season. Medical knowledge at the time was limited, and the combination of malnutrition, cold, and disease created a deadly cocktail. Death rates climbed as illnesses such as pneumonia, scurvy, and tuberculosis took advantage of weakened bodies. The poor, who lacked proper shelter and nutrition, bore the brunt of this silent epidemic. Yet, amid the despair, communities banded together where possible. Charitable groups attempted to distribute food and blankets, and churches opened their doors to those in need, providing brief respite from the cold and hunger. The frozen Thames also disrupted the very social fabric of the city. Crime increased as desperation led to theft and violence. Families were torn apart by starvation and disease. The desperation was palpable, echoing in the icy streets and frozen river alike. The city's infrastructure, already fragile, creaked under the weight of this prolonged freeze. Eventually, as spring approached, the ice began to thaw. Boats cautiously returned to the river, commerce slowly resumed, and the city began to breathe again. But the scars left by the winter lingered in memory. The freezing of the Thames in 1683 was a chilling testament to the fragile balance of human survival, how a single force of nature could unravel the routines of millions, exposing the vulnerabilities of societies most marginalized. Today, looking back at this frozen chapter of history, we see more than a natural curiosity or a quaint festival. We witness the raw struggle for survival in a city gripped by cold, hunger, and desperation. The frozen Thames was not just a river locked in ice, it was a reflection of the human condition under extreme duress, a story of endurance and tragedy written across a landscape of ice and shadow. Entire villages were abandoned in the Alps. After permanent snowfall, entire villages were abandoned in the Alps after permanent snowfall, the story of a chilling climate catastrophe that reshaped human lives and landscapes in ways still haunting today. Imagine entire communities, centuries old, suddenly facing an invisible enemy creeping down from the mountains, ice, snow, and relentless cold. This was no brief winter, but a permanent shift, an unforgiving freeze that swallowed fields, buried homes, and turned fertile valleys into wastelands of ice. Among the many villages struck by this frozen fate, Obergestell in the Swiss Alps stands as a stark example. Once a thriving alpine settlement, it fell victim to advancing glaciers that gradually erased its farmland, leaving residents with a grim choice: stay and starve, or abandon the only homes they had ever known. To fully grasp this tragedy, we must journey back to the period known as the Little Ice Age, a chilling era, roughly spanning from the 14th to the mid-19th century. This was a time when average global temperatures dipped noticeably, yet nowhere was this drop felt more devastatingly than in the high mountain regions of Europe. The Alps, majestic and imposing, became a battleground between humans and an expanding icy wilderness. Glaciers that had once been stable or retreating began to surge aggressively, pushing down valleys and swallowing everything in their path. The climatic shift was gradual but inexorable. Year by year, snowfall accumulated more heavily. Summers grew shorter and cooler, and the growing season for crops shrank drastically. Farming in the Alps was always precarious, dependent on a delicate balance of altitude, soil, and weather. But during the Little Ice Age, this balance was shattered. Fields that had fed families for generations turned barren beneath a growing blanket of snow and ice. Pastures where livestock grazed shriveled, forcing farmers to watch helplessly as their herds starved or succumbed to the cold. It was a domino effect. With no crops, no animals, the village economy collapsed. Trade routes that once connected alpine communities to broader markets became unreliable or impossible during extended winters. Food scarcity turned into famine. Disease followed hunger. In villages like Obergestell, the glacier's advance was not just a physical invasion, but a slow, silent suffocation. The ice did not crush homes overnight. Rather, it encroached slowly, pushing forward with a quiet but unstoppable power. Stones and soil were stripped from valley floors, carried by the moving ice to be deposited miles away. Over decades, farm plots shrank, and what once were fertile terraces became treacherous icy slopes. Families who had lived on that land for centuries found themselves forced to abandon ancestral homes. Some tried to resist, digging drainage ditches, reinforcing terraces, or shifting cultivation to marginal areas. But nature was relentless. Historical records from the period revealed the human side of this tragedy. Letters and chronicles describe desperation and heartbreak. Elders recount how they watched as their children grew weak from hunger, how neighbors disappeared or fled, and how entire hamlets fell silent. Some villagers tried migrating to lower altitudes or neighboring valleys, but competition for fertile land was fierce, and social structures could not easily absorb large waves of displaced people. The abandonment of villages was not merely a relocation, but a forced severing of cultural roots and identity. Oral traditions tell of ghostly whispers on icy winds and of shrines left to crumble beneath snowdrifts. But why did the glaciers advance so dramatically during this time? Modern climatology points to a complex combination of factors: reduced solar activity, increased volcanic eruptions, changes in ocean currents, and shifts in atmospheric circulation all contributed to the cooling trend. The Alps' high elevation made them especially sensitive to these changes, amplifying local snowfall and reducing melt rates. What might have been minor temperature drops elsewhere became catastrophic here. The Little Ice Age was not a single event, but a series of cold phases and milder interludes. Yet the overall trend was clear: a colder, harsher climate that reshaped the geography and human survival. The story of Obergestell and other abandoned alpine villages also reveals the resilience and adaptability of human communities. Some survivors integrated into nearby towns, while others took to pastoralism or forestry instead of traditional farming. The collapse forced shifts in social and economic structures, changing how alpine people lived and related to their environment. It also spurred innovations in architecture and land management, as those who remained learned to better withstand cold and snow. Alpine culture, shaped by centuries of living close to nature's limits, transformed in response to this frozen crisis. Today, the abandoned villages stand as eerie monuments to this frozen epoch. Ruined stone walls poke through meadows overgrown by alpine flora, but whispering of a vanished way of life. Archaeologists and historians study these sites to understand the intersection of climate and human fate. Glacial advances that once swallowed homes have now, in many places, receded due to modern warming, yet the lessons of the Little Ice Age remain. In an era when climate change again threatens communities worldwide, the alpine abandonment warns us of the profound impact that shifts in weather and temperature can have on societies dependent on fragile ecosystems. This history is a vivid reminder that climate is not a distant, abstract force, but a powerful actor shaping human destiny. The frozen, silent advance of glaciers into villages like Obergestell was a natural disaster unlike earthquakes or floods. It unfolded over decades, slowly strangling livelihoods and forcing painful choices. The tragedy was compounded by limited technology, isolation, and socioeconomic rigidity. Yet amid this suffering, people adapted, migrated, and endured. Their stories, passed down through generations, enrich our understanding of resilience in the face of environmental upheaval. So when we look upon the serene beauty of the Alps today, it is worth remembering the hidden scars beneath the snow. Ghost villages, lost fields, and the echo of human lives forever changed by a relentless frozen tide. The permanent snowfall that drove entire communities to extinction is not just a tale of cold and ice, but a profound chapter in human history. It speaks to our vulnerability, our tenacity, and the intricate dance between nature and civilization. This haunting legacy from the Little Ice Age continues to inspire and warn, urging us to respect the delicate balance upon which all human societies depend. That was the story of how entire villages were abandoned in the Alps after permanent snowfall. A real history event that still reverberates through time, reminding us of nature's overwhelming power and the fragility of human life on the edge of survival. Thousands froze to death in the Great Frost of 1709. Thousands froze to death in the Great Frost of 1709, an icy catastrophe that swept through Europe with merciless fury. This was not just a cold winter, it was one of the harshest years in recorded European history. A cataclysm that froze mighty rivers like the Seine in France, the Thames in England, and the Baltic Sea in northern Europe, halting life in its tracks. The year 1709 remains etched in the annals of history as a time when nature unleashed an unrelenting grip of frost and famine, pushing societies to the brink of collapse. The Great Frost was a brutal climax of the Little Ice Age, a period spanning centuries of cooler temperatures that unsettled agricultural cycles and economies alike. In early January, temperatures plummeted far below normal. The freezing cold hardened the earth, making it impossible to till soil or plant crops. Snow blanketed the fields and forests, cutting off vital supplies of firewood and fodder. Rivers and lakes turned into solid ice, disrupting transport and trade and isolating communities. For the poor, this meant the death sentence. For many, it was a slow and agonizing end. France, the most populous country in Europe at the time, suffered terribly. It was already weakened by years of war and economic hardship. When the frost came, it struck a devastating blow. The Seine, the great river flowing through Paris, froze solid. The bustling capital, a hub of trade and life, became locked in ice and silence. Markets shuttered, food supplies dwindled rapidly. Grain prices soared beyond reach for common folk, and hunger gnawed at every household. Reports from the time describe desperate scenes. Bread riots erupted as mobs stormed bakeries, fighting for scraps. Hunger turned neighbor against neighbor. But starvation was only part of the horror. Exposure to the merciless cold claimed countless lives. Thousands froze to death in the streets, in their homes, and even in their beds. Families huddled around dwindling fires, often made from chopped furniture or anything combustible. The poor suffered the most. Many had no means to buy firewood or warm clothing. Children were particularly vulnerable. Many froze to death silently in their sleep beneath thin blankets, their small bodies succumbing to the unforgiving chill. Across the English Channel, England faced similar misery. The Thames River, usually flowing with a lively commerce, froze thick enough for people to walk across. This rare natural phenomenon became a tragic stage for survival struggles. Food shortages hit London hard. The poor scavenged for anything edible, rotting meat, rats, and even tree bark. Bread became a luxury few could afford, and many resorted to selling their clothes just to purchase a loaf. The frozen river symbolized both an awe-inspiring spectacle and a chilling reminder of nature's deadly power. Further north, the Baltic Sea froze solid, enabling a desperate exodus of famine-stricken families from Sweden to Denmark. People walked across the ice, hoping to find refuge from starvation. Yet the journey was perilous. Thin ice and freezing winds claimed many lives before they could reach safety. This mass movement underscored the depth of despair gripping the region, as entire communities were forced to flee their homes to survive. The Great Frost of 1709 was not merely a climatic event. It was a socio-economic earthquake. Crops failed across the continent. Wheat, rye, oats, and barley perished under frost. The failure of the harvest meant that entire food supplies vanished in a single season. Livestock died en masse, either from hunger or cold. The combination of crop failure and livestock loss spiraled economies into crisis. Trade slowed or stopped, and inflation soared. Governments struggled to maintain order as famine-induced unrest grew. Historical records estimate that over 600,000 people died in France alone due to starvation and exposure. When combined with losses in England, the Low Countries, Germany, and Scandinavia, The death toll reaches into the millions. These losses devastated populations and left scars that would take decades to heal. Many villages were abandoned as survivors migrated in search of food and work. The social fabric frayed as desperation bred crime and conflict. The Great Frost also had political and cultural consequences. It exposed the vulnerabilities of states and monarchies, challenging their ability to provide for their people during crises. In France, King Louis XIV's government faced criticism for failing to respond adequately. The event planted seeds of distrust that, over decades, contributed to social unrest, culminating in the French Revolution later in the century. The hardship also inspired literature and art, reflecting human suffering and endurance in the face of nature's wrath. Scientists today look back at the Great Frost of 1709 as a vivid example of the climatic extremes possible during the Little Ice Age. Tree ring studies and ice core data confirm the unprecedented cold snap that gripped Europe that winter. It reminds us how tightly human survival is linked to environmental stability. When nature's balance tips, the consequences can be catastrophic and swift. The frozen rivers, the starving masses, the silent deaths in the cold all paint a grim picture of a Europe caught in a deadly freeze. Yet, within this tragedy, stories of resilience emerge, neighbors sharing scarce resources, communities banding together, and the indomitable will to survive against all odds. Remembering the Great Frost of 1709 is more than recalling a cold winter. It is understanding how climate can shape history, impact societies, and define human endurance. It is a stark lesson on vulnerability and survival, and a powerful reminder of the delicate balance we all depend on. As you reflect on this frozen winter from over 3 centuries ago, consider how much we depend on the seasons, the harvests, and the rhythms of nature. When those rhythms break, the consequences ripple through every aspect of life: food, shelter, health, and hope. The Great Frost was a cruel teacher, but its legacy remains a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the ever-present power of the natural world. That brutal winter of 1709 forever changed the course of many lives and left a frozen imprint on the collective memory of Europe, reminding us that beneath the surface of progress, we remain bound to the unpredictable forces of nature. Baltic Sea froze and people walked across to escape famine. In the early 15th century, Northern Europe faced one of its most brutal and unforgiving winters, an era when the natural world and human survival collided in tragic, unforgettable ways. The year was 1423, and the Baltic Sea, usually a sprawling body of cold, churning water, froze over so thoroughly that it created a frozen pathway between lands. This rare and terrifying phenomenon turned a vast expanse of sea into a fragile bridge of ice connecting Sweden and Denmark. But this was no gift of nature. It was a desperate, perilous lifeline for thousands caught in the grip of famine and starvation. To truly understand the horror and human drama of that winter, we must first grasp the context of the time. The early 1400s in Scandinavia were harsh years marked by a series of poor harvests, economic hardships, and political instability. Europe was still feeling the aftershocks of the Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of cooling that disrupted weather patterns across the continent. Crops failed, food stores dwindled, and famine swept mercilessly across regions that had previously relied on predictable seasonal cycles. Sweden, largely rural and agrarian, was especially vulnerable. The country's economy depended heavily on farming and fishing, and with the worsening cold and crop failures, entire communities faced starvation. People clung to their villages and farmlands, hoping for relief that never came. Food scarcity was not just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Starvation weakened bodies, making people susceptible to disease. Social order frayed as desperation mounted, and many families found themselves trapped between the harsh winter and the slow, cruel advance of hunger. Amid this desperation, the frozen Baltic Sea offered an unlikely route to survival. The ice, thick enough in some areas to bear human weight, formed a tenuous bridge toward Denmark, where food supplies, while limited, were comparatively more stable. For many, the decision to flee across this icy expanse was a gamble, a chance to escape death from famine, but with no guarantee of safety on the other side. This journey across the ice was not a simple crossing. The Baltic Sea is notorious for its unpredictable weather and conditions, and even when frozen, the ice was treacherous and unstable in places. Thin patches threatened to crack and swallow those who dared to walk over them. The cold was relentless, with biting winds and temperatures plunging well below freezing. People wrapped themselves in whatever clothing they could salvage, clutching their few possessions and children close, hoping to outrun starvation and exposure. Families set out on foot in groups, sometimes hundreds strong, forming human chains to steady one another. Their progress was slow and perilous. The ice groaned and shifted beneath their feet, a reminder of nature's fragile hold over this frozen passage. Some made it across, collapsing from exhaustion or cold upon reaching Danish shores, where aid was scarce but life was still possible. Others fell victim to the ice giving way, plummeting into the freezing waters below and lost forever in the merciless Baltic depths. Contemporary chroniclers tell harrowing tales of these crossings. Records from that time speak of people dying en masse on the ice, their bodies frozen in place or swept away by the currents beneath. The imagery is haunting. A ghostly procession etched across a frozen sea, a desperate migration born not of choice, but of absolute necessity. This event stands as a stark testament to human resilience in the face of environmental extremes, but also to the vulnerability of societies caught in the unforgiving grip of climatic shifts. The freezing of the Baltic Sea in 1423 was not an isolated event. It occurred within a larger tapestry of climatic disruptions during the Little Ice Age, a period spanning from roughly the 14th to the 19th century, characterized by colder temperatures and volatile weather across Europe and beyond. These climatic conditions exacerbated famines, wars, and social upheavals throughout the continent. In Scandinavia, harsh winters like that of 1423 challenged the very survival of communities, forcing extraordinary responses like the crossing of frozen seas. This phenomenon also highlights the complex interplay between environment and human history. The physical environment shaped migration patterns, economic stability, and even political developments. Denmark, for example, by virtue of its geographical position and relatively better food resources, became a refuge in times of crisis. This seasonal, dangerous migration across the frozen Baltic Sea symbolized not just survival, but also shifting demographics and cultural exchanges between Scandinavian peoples. Moreover, the event foreshadowed the enduring human struggle with climate change long before the term existed. It reminds us how fragile our systems are and how dependent humanity is on a stable climate. The desperation of those who walked the Baltic ice in 1423 echoes today as modern societies face their own climatic and environmental challenges. Archaeological findings and historical documents help paint a clearer picture of this tragic episode. Although many of the victims remain nameless, their story survives through the ice itself, in oral traditions, chronicled annals, and the frozen memories embedded in the landscapes they once traversed. The frozen sea became a passage not just in geography, but in history, a silent witness to lives upended and destinies reshaped by the cruel hand of nature. In the end, the frozen Baltic Sea of 1423 stands as a chilling reminder of the tenuous balance between human endurance and environmental forces. It is a story of survival and loss, of hope amidst despair, and a poignant chapter in the saga of humanity's ongoing battle with the natural world. For those who risked everything to walk across that ice, the sea was both a barrier and a bridge, a frozen highway to a chance at life, but also a cold grave for many. Remembering this event is not just about recounting history. It's about honoring resilience in the face of overwhelming odds and recognizing the deep connections between climate, geography, and human fate. The echoes of that bitter winter, frozen in time, continue to teach us lessons about adaptation, courage, and the costs of survival when nature's balance is shattered. This haunting episode urges us to reflect on our own vulnerabilities and strengths as we navigate a world still subject to the unpredictable and often unforgiving power of the natural environment. The frozen Baltic Sea of 1423 is more than a historical footnote. It is a testament to the enduring spirit of those who faced the abyss and dared to cross, carrying with them the fragile hope of survival through one of history's coldest, darkest chapters. Dutch canals froze and were used for ice transport and corpses. During the 17th century, the Dutch Republic was a powerhouse of commerce, art, and maritime innovation. Cities like Amsterdam thrived on their intricate network of canals, veins of water that carried goods, people, and life itself throughout the bustling metropolis. But every few decades, when the bitter grip of winter descended, this watery lifeline would freeze solid, transforming the canals into vast shimmering highways of ice. The year was not just any ordinary winter. During these deep freezes in the 1600s, Amsterdam's canals became frozen roads, allowing passage where streets were impassable under heavy snow and ice. What makes these frozen canals a chilling chapter in history is the duality of their use, not only as conduits for commerce and daily life, but as grim pathways for transporting the dead when conventional carts and wagons could no longer traverse the snow-covered streets. The winters of the early modern period were harsh and relentless, far different from the milder winters of recent times. Known as part of the Little Ice Age, roughly spanning from the 14th to the 19th centuries, this era was marked by prolonged periods of cold and devastating climatic shifts that had profound social and economic impacts across Europe. The Dutch, whose cities were built around canals both for transport and defense, faced unique challenges during these freezing spells. The canals that connected neighborhoods and markets, usually bustling with boats and barges, would turn into solid ice sheets, thick enough to support people, horses, and even heavy loads. While this presented an opportunity for frozen transport and recreation, it also unveiled a dark reality beneath the surface. One of the less spoken of and haunting uses of these frozen waterways was the transportation of corpses. During severe winters, deep snow and icy roads rendered horse-drawn carts useless. Streets became so treacherous and impassable that burying the dead in a timely manner became a logistical nightmare. In Amsterdam and other canal cities, the only reliable passage for moving bodies to burial grounds was over the frozen canals themselves. The ice served as an alternative route when roads were blocked by snowdrifts or turned into impassable mud after thawing periods. These frozen canals became silent, eerie highways, bearing the weight of life's inevitable end. The situation was compounded by the public health crises of the time. In the 1600s, plague outbreaks and other contagious diseases were recurrent visitors to European cities, including Amsterdam. The overcrowded conditions, combined with the harsh climate, created perfect breeding grounds for illness. Bodies could accumulate faster than the city's capacity to bury them safely. Transporting the dead via the canals was a grim necessity, ensuring that burial rituals could continue and the spread of disease was at least partially contained. This practice was a stark reminder of mortality's inescapable presence, especially during winters when survival itself was precarious. But the frozen canals were not only reserved for the somber task of transporting the dead. They also became vital arteries for commerce and daily life. The Dutch economy in the 17th century was booming, and trade never fully halted even during the worst winters. Merchants, craftsmen, and common citizens adapted to the icy conditions by shifting their transportation to the frozen waterways. Sledges, ice skates, and horse-drawn sleighs glided across the ice, moving goods ranging from fish and cheese to textiles and even heavy building materials. This ingenious use of the frozen canals showcased the resilience and adaptability of Dutch society in the face of climatic adversity. One of the most famous cultural phenomena tied to frozen Dutch canals is the emergence of ice skating as both a practical and recreational activity. The canals froze consistently enough that skating became an integral part of winter life. Scenes of children and adults gliding over the ice, merchants conducting business on skates, and travelers journeying across cities on frozen waterways are immortalized in the works of Dutch Golden Age painters such as Hendrik Averkamp. These paintings not only captured picturesque winter scenes, but also offer us valuable historical insight into how the Dutch harnessed and celebrated the frozen canals. Yet, beneath these idyllic images lies the harsh reality of the winter's toll on human life and the city's infrastructure. The frozen canals, while a means of transport, were also fraught with dangers. Ice could crack unexpectedly, trapping those who ventured out or causing sledges and horses to fall through. The cold itself was deadly, and the city's population had to be ever vigilant. The canals, so central to the city's identity and prosperity, were transformed into a double-edged sword, both a facilitator of life and a conduit of death. Historical records from city archives and chronicles of the time describe how municipal workers and volunteers took great care to monitor the thickness and safety of the ice, marking safe paths and clearing snow to ease passage. There was also a practical knowledge passed down through communities about when it was safe to cross and when the ice was too thin. But this knowledge did not eliminate tragedy entirely. There are accounts of accidents and losses, and the image of a frozen canal with its deceptive beauty hiding deep, frigid water beneath remains a powerful symbol of the era. Moreover, the use of frozen canals for transporting corpses underscores the interplay between environment, society, and mortality during the Little Ice Age. It reveals how natural phenomena imposed unexpected constraints on urban life and forced communities to adapt rapidly and sometimes grimly. This adaptation was not merely logistical. It touched cultural, social, and psychological aspects of Dutch life. The frozen canals were, in a way, a mirror of the fragile balance between life and death, warmth and cold, survival and surrender. In conclusion, the frozen canals of 17th-century Amsterdam were far more than just frozen waterways. They were vital arteries sustaining a city caught between the forces of nature and the relentless demands of human life. As frozen roads, they enabled transport and commerce in the face of brutal winters. As silent pathways of death, they bore the weight of the city's deceased when traditional means failed. This haunting duality reflects the resilience, ingenuity, and somber realities of the Dutch people living through the Little Ice Age. Their story invites us to reflect on how humanity confronts the harshness of nature and finds ways to persist, sometimes in ways both beautiful and haunting. This chapter of Dutch history reminds us that beneath the tranquil beauty of winter landscapes, there often lies a complex and intense human story, one of survival, adaptation, and the ever-present shadow of mortality gliding silently over frozen canals. Children froze in bed as firewood ran out during the Maunder minimum. The Maunder minimum, a mysterious and prolonged period of drastically reduced solar activity, cast a long, cold shadow over Europe during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. It coincided with the harshest decades of the Little Ice Age, a time when winters grew bitter and unrelenting and summers turned short and chilly. The skies remained gray and sunless, crops withered under the chill, and the cold seeped deep into every corner of daily life. For the poorest families in Central Europe, this wasn't just an uncomfortable season. It was a slow, creeping death sentence, a merciless test of endurance, where warmth itself became a rare and precious commodity, and one that many could not afford. In those years, entire regions were gripped by a relentless winter that seemed to stretch on forever. Forests, once plentiful sources of firewood, were stripped bare as demand skyrocketed. The trees fell one by one to feed the insatiable need for heat, but the supply could not keep pace with the cruel cold. Firewood became scarce and prices soared beyond the reach of the most vulnerable. Poor families, already stretched thin by dwindling harvests and rising food costs, found themselves unable to secure enough fuel to warm their homes. The hearth, the symbolic heart of family life, grew cold and dark. Within the cramped, drafty homes of peasants and laborers, the chill crept in like an invisible predator. Walls built of thin timber or stone offered little protection, and the winds whistled through gaps and cracks. Families huddled together beneath threadbare blankets, sharing the scant warmth of one another's bodies. But for children whose small frames were less able to withstand the cold, these fragile protections were often not enough. Many lay frozen in their beds, victims of a winter that stole heat and life in equal measure. It is a harrowing image. Infants and young children slipping quietly into the icy embrace of night, their breath shallow, their little bodies too cold to stir. In the deepest hours when the world was silent, but for the crackle of frost outside, families awoke to unbearable loss. The walls, once a refuge, seemed to close in like a tomb. This silent suffering was repeated across countless villages and towns, stories often unrecorded except in whispered tales and mournful church records. The scarcity of firewood was not the only factor compounding the tragedy. The Little Ice Age brought crop failures, famine, and economic hardship that left parents struggling not only for warmth, but for food. Malnutrition weakened children's bodies, making them more vulnerable to the cold and to disease. Respiratory illnesses surged in the damp, chilled homes. The absence of modern medicine meant that even minor ailments could prove fatal. The cruel winter acted as a silent accomplice, exacerbating every vulnerability. Communities tried desperately to cope. Charitable efforts, often led by the church, sought to distribute whatever warmth and food they could muster. Neighbors shared what little they had, and folk traditions of communal fire-watching and collective gathering around meager hearths emerged. Yet these acts of solidarity, though powerful, could only do so much against the relentless march of cold and time. Historical records from monasteries and parish registers tell of sudden spikes in child mortality during the coldest winters. In some regions, death rates among infants doubled or tripled. Entire generations were marked by loss and hardship, scars etched deep into the social fabric. The psychological toll on grieving families was immense, a quiet agony endured beneath frozen breaths and darkened rooms. Yet, amid this suffering, human resilience flickered like a fragile flame. Families adapted by layering clothes, using makeshift insulation, and attempting to preserve body heat through close sleeping arrangements. Some turned to alternative fuels, peat, dung, or dried leaves, though these were less efficient and often produced noxious smoke. The desperate search for warmth drove innovation born of necessity, even if it came too late for many. The Maunder minimum's relentless cold years remind us that the forces of nature can be merciless arbiters of human fate, especially when society's most vulnerable are pushed to the brink. The children who froze in their beds beneath thin blankets were not merely victims of climate, but of poverty and scarcity, intertwined in a deadly web. Their silent suffering echoes through history as a stark testament to the precariousness of life in harsh times. Today, as we study climate patterns and their impacts on humanity, these stories serve as sobering reminders. They urge us to remember the fragility of our existence, the importance of warmth, not just of body, but of community and care. In the frozen nights of the Little Ice Age, amid the howling winds and dark skies, the simplest human need to be warm to survive became a battle for life itself. Crops failed for years, and bread riots exploded across Europe. Crops failed for years, and bread riots exploded across Europe. A desperate chapter in history where cold, unyielding summers starved entire populations and ignited fierce uprisings across the continent. This was not a sudden crisis, but a drawn-out nightmare spanning years. A time when nature's wrath took the form of failed harvests, empty granaries, and the crumbling social order that follows hunger. Between the mid-18th century and beyond, Europe faced a series of harsh climatic setbacks, with cold summers, relentless rains, and early frosts destroying staple crops, wheat, rye, barley, that were the backbone of everyday survival. When the fields withered and grain supplies dwindled, bread, the staff of life, became scarce, expensive, and ultimately a symbol of both sustenance and oppression. The year 1772 stands out in this grim saga. In Paris, the heart of Enlightenment and monarchy alike, the cracks in society's facade became glaringly visible. Repeated crop failures had driven up the price of bread beyond what ordinary people could afford. Bakers and millers, often viewed as intermediaries profiting from scarcity, became targets of mounting public fury. Mobs surged through the streets, storming bakeries and grain warehouses. These were not mindless acts of violence, but desperate attempts to seize food and force distribution. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe chaotic scenes, shouts echoing through narrow alleys, broken doors, and the raw hunger etched on faces of men, women, and children alike. The bread riots were as much about survival as they were a violent indictment of a system failing its people. Across Europe, the pattern was repeated. In Germany's towns and villages, grain shortages sparked violent protests and unrest. Peasants who had labored tirelessly found their yields destroyed by unseasonal cold and damp. The nobility and ruling classes struggled to maintain order while grappling with the stark reality that nature had struck a blow to the agricultural foundation of their economies. Britain, too, was not spared. Markets tightened, and food prices soared, fueling resentment that would, in the coming decades, feed revolutionary ideas. The bread riots became a dark mirror reflecting broader socio-political tensions simmering under the surface. But why were these crop failures so persistent and widespread? The answer lies again in the climatic chaos of the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long period marked by cooler temperatures and unpredictable weather patterns. Summers that should have been warm and nourishing were instead cold, wet, and short. Seedlings drowned in storms or failed to mature before early frosts. Repeatedly, farmers sowed fields only to watch crops rot or yield meager harvests unfit to feed their families or communities. The ripple effects were devastating. Livestock starved without fodder, trade routes struggled to transport what little food remained, and famine loomed as a constant threat. Historical records reveal the extent of this crisis. Parish registers and tax documents show spikes in mortality coinciding with poor harvest years. Diaries and letters describe people resorting to eating roots, tree bark, and even carrion. Governments attempted interventions, stockpiling grain, regulating prices, or importing supplies, but these efforts were often too little, too late. Social unrest was inevitable when survival was on the line. Bread, once a simple daily staple, became a potent symbol of justice and injustice. The riots were not mere outbreaks of violence, but desperate political statements from people pushed to the brink. The bread riots of 1772 and surrounding years thus represent a tipping point where environmental hardship collided with social inequity. They foreshadowed larger upheavals to come, including the French Revolution, where hunger and frustration erupted into transformative political change. The lessons of this period remain relevant. Food security is not just a matter of agriculture, but a foundation of societal stability. When climate disrupts that foundation, the consequences can ripple through every level of human life, from the fields to the streets, from markets to monarchies. In reflecting on these events, we recognize the profound vulnerability of pre-industrial societies to climatic fluctuations. Without modern technology, irrigation, or globalized trade, people were at the mercy of the weather. The cold summers that ruined crops were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern that shaped European history in profound ways. The bread riots were the anguished voice of millions struggling against starvation, inequality, and the harsh forces of nature. Today, as we face our own challenges with climate change and food security, the bitter echoes of the 18th century bread riots remind us how critical it is to anticipate and mitigate such crises. They underscore the need for resilience, justice, and foresight in ensuring that no society descends into hunger-driven chaos again. Rivers froze so hard that castles could be attacked on foot. During the unforgiving winter of 1608, Europe experienced a chilling phenomenon that defied the natural defenses which had protected its fortresses for centuries. The great frost of that year was so severe that rivers, usually formidable barriers guarding castles, froze solid enough to become unexpected highways for invading armies. This icy transformation shattered the very foundations of medieval warfare strategy, exposing castles to attacks that, until then, seemed impossible. Rivers like the Rhine, the Loire, and the Elbe had long been natural moats, wide, fast-flowing, and treacherous, that shielded castles from enemy advances. Their freezing over disrupted these defenses dramatically. The ice was thick and unyielding, creating treacherous but passable paths where before stood impassable waters. Castles that once relied on these watery ramparts found themselves vulnerable overnight, their moats transformed into frozen bridges for foes. This shift brought about a new kind of warfare. Armies took advantage of the frozen rivers, crossing them under the cover of winter's harsh silence. The unexpected approach left defenders unprepared, as their traditional defenses, drawbridges, walls, and water barriers, meant little against an enemy who could simply walk across the ice. Surprise assaults erupted as attackers marched directly onto castle grounds, bypassing fortifications thought secure. The freezing rivers also complicated communication and supply lines. Castles isolated by snow and ice could neither receive reinforcements easily nor send warnings quickly. This isolation often turned the tide in favor of the attackers, who exploited both the physical vulnerability and the confusion caused by the frozen landscape. Historical records from 1608 recount several such sieges where frozen rivers played a decisive role. In regions of Central Europe, castles along the Elbe and Oder rivers fell after defenders failed to anticipate the audacity of enemies crossing frozen waters. The psychological impact was profound. A natural defense turned into a fatal weakness, undermined confidence and morale. Moreover, the frozen rivers affected not only military strategy, but also civilian life. The icy expanses became dangerous thoroughfares, where skirmishes and raids spilled over into villages and towns. Refugees fled from war zones, often forced to cross the frozen rivers themselves, risking the thin ice and bitter cold. The Great Frost of 1608 serves as a powerful reminder of nature's ability to rewrite the rules of conflict. The rivers that once offered safety became conduits of peril. Castles, long symbols of strength and protection, were suddenly exposed by the very elements that had sustained them. This event forced military commanders and rulers to rethink their defensive tactics and highlighted the importance of adapting to environmental extremes. It also underscored the vulnerability of human constructs against the unpredictable forces of climate. In the end, the frozen rivers of 1608 not only reshaped the physical landscape, but also altered the course of warfare, turning ice into a battlefield and forever changing how castles were defended during winter's cruel rain. Livestock died standing up in the fields from cold shock. In the bitter winter of 1658, England was gripped by a sudden and merciless cold snap, so severe that it brought the countryside to a standstill, not only halting daily life, but inflicting a devastating blow to its agricultural backbone. Farmers and villagers across the land bore witness to an extraordinary and haunting phenomenon. Livestock freezing solid in the fields, caught mid-step, as if time itself had frozen alongside them. Sheep and cattle, vital to rural economies and survival, were left immobile, stiffened by the cold, their bodies locked in the final moments of motion. To understand the full impact of this chilling event, it is essential to place it within the broader climatic context of 17th century England. This period fell within the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long phase of cooler temperatures and erratic weather that profoundly affected agriculture, economy, and daily life across Europe. Harsh winters were common, but the cold snap of 1658 was especially abrupt and intense, catching communities unprepared and plunging the countryside into a frozen silence. Farmers depended heavily on their animals for wool, milk, meat, and labor. The health and productivity of sheep and cattle were essential not only for local sustenance, but also for trade and economic stability. The sudden onslaught of freezing temperatures, however, proved catastrophic. The cold was so severe and swift that the animals exposed in open fields or pastures experienced what can only be described as cold shock, an immediate and overwhelming physiological response that caused their muscles to seize and their bodies to freeze in place. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe scenes almost surreal in their stillness and tragedy. Animals were found standing upright, as if frozen mid-walk, their limbs stiff and encased in layers of ice. These frozen creatures became grim monuments across the fields, a stark testament to the sudden cruelty of nature. The farmers faced the grim task of physically breaking the animals free from their icy prisons. Sheep and cattle had to be chopped from the ice to be removed or buried. The sheer scale of loss was staggering, inflicting severe economic hardship on already strained rural communities. This phenomenon was not just an isolated incident of cold weather, but a reflection of the wider vulnerabilities inherent in the agrarian societies of the time. The Little Ice Age's persistent chill meant that farming cycles were disrupted, pasture growth stunted, and food supplies threatened. Livestock, unable to find shelter or adequate food in the frozen landscape, succumbed quickly to the elements. The suddenness of the 1658 freeze left little chance for farmers to protect their animals or prepare for the catastrophic losses. The physiological reasons behind livestock freezing mid-step can be understood through the lens of cold shock and hypothermia. When exposed abruptly to sub-zero temperatures, animals experience a rapid drop in core body temperature, leading to muscular rigidity and circulatory failure. Without shelter or warmth, they become immobilized, and in the case of extreme cold, the surrounding moisture or snow can freeze around their bodies, locking them in place. This tragic immobilization, caught forever in the final moment of life, was a cruel end to creatures central to rural survival. The impact on communities was profound. With their herds decimated, farmers faced food shortages, loss of income, and the daunting challenge of rebuilding livestock populations in the following years. The ripple effects extended beyond the farms. Markets felt the pinch, wool and meat supplies dwindled, and economic distress spread through towns and villages dependent on agriculture. Moreover, the frozen fields of 1658 serve as a chilling reminder of the broader climatic struggles faced during the Little Ice Age. The period was marked not only by cold winters, but by unpredictable and extreme weather events that repeatedly tested human resilience. Crop failures, food scarcity, and livestock losses became grim features of rural life, fueling social unrest and hardship. Historical records in farmers' journals preserve these haunting images of frozen livestock, offering a window into the lived experiences of those who endured the cold's brutal grip. They remind us that beyond the statistics and climate data are real stories of suffering, survival, and adaptation. In reflection, the frozen animals of 1658 symbolize the delicate balance between humans, their livelihoods, and the environment. This tragic episode reveals how sudden climatic shifts can upend the natural rhythms of life and the profound vulnerability of agricultural societies reliant on the well-being of their animals. As we study this event today, it not only deepens our understanding of historical climate impacts, but also resonates with modern concerns about weather extremes and food security. The memory of those frozen sheep and cattle stands as a poignant testament to the enduring challenges of living with an unpredictable and often harsh natural world. Through these frozen moments in time, we are reminded of the resilience required to face environmental adversity and the importance of preparing for the unexpected forces that shape human history. The 1658 cold snap was not just a meteorological event, it was a crisis that tested the very fabric of rural England, leaving an indelible mark etched in ice and memory. Entire economies collapsed when fishing ports froze solid. In the harsh and unforgiving climate of Scandinavia, the sea has always been more than just a source of beauty. It was a lifeline. For centuries, fishing ports along the coasts of Norway, Iceland, and Greenland sustained entire communities, their economies woven tightly into the ebb and flow of the ocean's bounty. But when winter's icy grip tightened, turning the sea and its bustling ports into solid blocks of ice, these lifelines shattered. Entire economies collapsed, plunging fishing communities into desperate survival. One of the most harrowing examples lies in Iceland, where frozen ports stopped all trade in fishing, forcing people to survive on boiled leather and old seal fat, foodstuffs born out of sheer desperation. Fishing was the economic backbone of Scandinavian coastal towns. For Icelanders, cod, herring, and other fish provided not only food, but also trade goods, vital for acquiring essentials like grain and firewood. Fishermen's livelihoods depended on access to open waters and the ability to dock and unload their catches. But during the coldest winters of the Little Ice Age, roughly spanning from the 14th to the 19th centuries, these ports froze solid. The icy chokehold on the harbors meant that boats could neither leave nor unload, markets dried up, and the flow of goods ceased. Without fresh fish, the main staple of the local diet, food scarcity quickly escalated. The collapse of fishing port activity had a ripple effect far beyond the docks. In towns built on maritime commerce, entire economic systems relied on the timely arrival and dispatch of goods. Merchants who traded fish for grain or textiles found their businesses grinding to a halt. Blacksmiths, coopers, and other tradespeople who depended on the fishing industry suffered from lack of work and dwindling income. Seasonal laborers lost their means of sustenance, and the social fabric began to strain under the pressure of scarcity and economic stagnation. In Iceland, the situation became dire. The country's isolation, combined with the long, brutal winters, meant that food shortages could quickly become life-threatening. With ports iced over, fresh fish was off the table. Instead, Icelanders resorted to consuming whatever was left, boiled leather and old seal fat. Boiling leather was a method used to extract whatever nutrition possible from animal hides, usually used in emergencies, as leather offers little nourishment and is difficult to digest. Old seal fat, often rancid and stored for long periods, became a desperate source of calories. These austere diets were a testament to human endurance, but also a stark indicator of the collapse of the usual economic and food systems. Historical accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries describe how entire communities faced starvation and hardship when the sea froze. The inability to fish or trade caused widespread famine, increased mortality, and forced migrations. Social unrest sometimes followed as the strain of scarcity tested communal bonds and governance. These conditions illustrated how intimately tied the survival of these societies was to their maritime environment and how devastating climatic shifts could be. This collapse of coastal economies during frozen winters also had long-term consequences. Food insecurity and economic disruption slowed population growth, reduced labor availability, and hampered community development. The recurring nature of these freezes meant that recovery was never guaranteed before the next harsh winter arrived. Moreover, the psychological toll on communities facing repeated winters of scarcity and isolation shaped cultural memory and resilience, influencing traditions, folklore, and social organization. Despite these challenges, the Scandinavian and Icelandic people developed strategies to cope. Stockpiling dried fish, preserving seal meat, and relying on livestock during winters became critical survival tactics. Communities reinforced cooperation and shared resources to endure the cyclical nature of these harsh winters. Yet, the collapse of fishing ports remained one of the most acute shocks to their economies, highlighting the vulnerability of societies deeply dependent on a single natural resource in a fluctuating climate. In sum, the freezing of Scandinavian fishing ports in the 1600s and beyond was not a mere inconvenience. It was a catastrophic economic event that threatened the very survival of coastal communities. The frozen harbors brought commerce to a halt, severed lifelines of sustenance, and forced people into unimaginable dietary extremes like boiled leather and old seal fat. These episodes reveal a vivid historical lesson about the interplay between environment, economy, and human resilience in the face of nature's merciless winters. Wine frozen in cups and glass shattered from cold. The winter of 1709 was a season of extremes, one that even the grandest halls of Versailles could not escape. In the annals of history, this year is remembered as one of the coldest winters Europe had ever faced during the Little Ice Age. For the courtiers of Louis XIV's opulent palace, where elegance and luxury were woven into every corner, the bitter cold brought a surreal and unexpected assault on their daily lives. It was a winter so fierce that it transcended the boundaries between social classes and status, freezing even the wine in their goblets and shattering their precious crystal with a cruel, icy hand. Versailles, a symbol of royal grandeur and decadence, was no stranger to splendor. Its vast gardens, gilded salons, and elaborate feasts were the backdrop of a court that prided itself on refinement and excess. Yet, in the heart of this majestic palace, nature's icy breath challenged the very notion of comfort and control. The winter's chill seeped through thick stone walls and ornate windows, slipping into drawing rooms and dining halls where nobles once gathered in warmth and laughter. What seemed impossible became reality as the temperature plunged night after night to record lows. The wine, a staple of courtly life and a symbol of indulgence, behaved in ways no one had anticipated. Thick red and white wines, usually enjoyed at carefully moderated temperatures, began to freeze in the very glasses from which they were sipped. Imagine the astonishment and disbelief of the courtiers as their goblets, brimming with liquid luxury, turned solid, crystals forming on the surface, the liquid's warmth surrendered to the overwhelming cold. This phenomenon was not merely a quirk of nature, but a powerful demonstration of the winter's severity. Wine typically freezes at temperatures below -5 degrees Celsius due to its alcohol content, but the sustained cold in 1709 pushed the environment well beyond usual limits. Entire cellars and wine storage areas were at risk, as even the carefully maintained underground vaults failed to shield their precious contents from the relentless freeze. More striking, however, was the damage wrought on the very vessels that held the wine. The exquisite glassware of Versailles, delicate goblets, fluted flasks, and hand-blown crystal were not made to withstand the sudden contraction caused by such freezing. As the wine solidified inside, it expanded, exerting pressure on the fragile glass. Overnight, many of these ornate pieces cracked, shattered, or fractured, leaving shards of once-cherished luxury scattered across marble floors and velvet-lined tables. This breaking of glass symbolized more than material loss. It reflected the vulnerability of human craftsmanship against the raw forces of nature. The fragile beauty of these objects, meticulously crafted by skilled artisans, was undone by the invisible hand of winter's fury. Letters and journals from the period record the shock of courtiers witnessing their prized possessions broken without warning, the sounds of cracking glass echoing like a warning through the halls of power. The freezing wine and shattered glass also held a deeper metaphor for the fragility of the ancien regime itself. At a time when the monarchy wielded enormous influence, nature's indiscriminate chill exposed the limits of human dominion. The cold did not discriminate between peasant and prince, between palace and peasant cottage. It was a reminder that even in the midst of grandeur, humanity remained at nature's mercy. Beyond the immediate spectacle, the winter of 1709 wrought profound economic consequences. The loss of wine stock struck a blow to the vineyards and merchants who depended on stable climates for their livelihoods. Supply chains were disrupted, and the demand for firewood and fuel soared as cold permeated every corner of daily existence. Versailles itself, despite its vast resources, grappled with the challenge of keeping its inhabitants warm and fed, highlighting the universal struggle against this harsh climate. Historians note that this winter is among the coldest in European history, with rivers freezing, harvests failing, and mortality rates rising across the continent. The image of wine freezing in goblets and glass cracking from cold stands as an emblem of a world turned upside down, a poignant vignette capturing the clash between human luxury and natural brutality. As the ice finally thawed and warmth returned to the gilded halls, the shattered glass was swept away and the frozen wine melted back into liquid form. Yet the memory of that winter lingered in the collective consciousness of the court and beyond. It served as a chilling reminder of vulnerability, a story passed down in whispered anecdotes and preserved in the chronicles of Versailles. Today, when we imagine the glittering banquets of the Sun King, we might also recall that harsh winter when wine froze in crystal goblets, and even the most refined glassware could not withstand the bite of nature's coldest breath. It is a story that evokes the fragile intersection of opulence and adversity, the delicate balance between human achievement and the unpredictable forces that shape our world. Mass starvation hit Iceland. When Volcano met Ice Age, in 1783, Iceland faced one of the most catastrophic environmental disasters in its history, a brutal collision of volcanic fury and relentless cold that triggered mass starvation and suffering on an unimaginable scale. The eruption of the Loki volcano during one of the coldest decades in the Little Ice Age unleashed devastation that rippled far beyond the barren lava fields. This was no ordinary eruption. It was a climatic and ecological nightmare that reshaped Iceland's landscape, economy, and population in a matter of months. The Loki fissure erupted with an intensity that lasted for 8 months, from June 1783 through February 1784, spewing vast quantities of lava and toxic gases into the atmosphere. The immediate physical destruction was staggering. Fertile farmland buried beneath molten rock, pastures poisoned by acid rain and volcanic gases, and skies darkened by ash and haze. But the eruption's true horror lay in the invisible fallout that fell across Iceland's fragile environment. The sulfur dioxide released combined with moisture in the atmosphere to create deadly acid rain, which destroyed crops and poisoned livestock, primary sources of food for Iceland's isolated communities. This eruption coincided with a period of already harsh climatic conditions. The late 18th century was marked by cold, unstable weather as part of the broader Little Ice Age cooling. Icelanders were no strangers to hard winters and short growing seasons, but the Loki eruption intensified these hardships exponentially. Crops that might have barely survived the cold were decimated by acid rain and toxic fallout. Livestock, weakened by poor forage and poisoned water, died in unprecedented numbers. The chain reaction was swift and merciless. Within months, food shortages escalated into widespread famine. Contemporary accounts describe harrowing scenes of desperation. Families struggling to find even the most basic sustenance, communities ravaged by malnutrition and disease, and a death toll that soared to catastrophic levels. It is estimated that over a quarter of Iceland's population, some 20,000 people, succumbed to starvation and related illnesses in the months following the eruption. This demographic shock devastated the social fabric of the island, leaving scars that would last generations. The Loki eruption's effects were not confined to Iceland's shores. The vast volumes of volcanic gases released into the atmosphere circulated globally, leading to climatic anomalies such as harsh winters and crop failures across Europe and even beyond. Known as the Loki haze, this phenomenon contributed to famines and health crises thousands of miles away. Yet, for Iceland, the disaster was deeply personal and immediate, a stark reminder of how environmental catastrophes can intertwine with human vulnerability. What made the Loki eruption so deadly was the convergence of natural forces and societal limitations. Iceland's economy at the time depended heavily on subsistence agriculture and livestock rearing, with little surplus to buffer against environmental shocks. Infrastructure and governance systems were ill-equipped to respond to such a rapid and widespread disaster. The isolation of Iceland also meant that aid and resources from abroad were minimal or delayed. The population faced the crisis with limited means to adapt or escape. The aftermath of the eruption saw shifts in Icelandic society. Survivors had to rebuild livelihoods from near total ruin, adapt farming practices, and reorganize communities. Oral histories and written records from the period convey profound grief but also resilience, a testament to human endurance in the face of nature's fury. The tragedy of the Laki eruption remains a powerful case study of how volcanic activity can amplify climatic extremes, leading to cascading failures in food production and public health. It highlights the precarious balance between environment and society, especially in regions vulnerable to natural hazards. In modern times, the Laki disaster serves as a sobering warning of how interconnected Earth systems are, and how localized geological events can have far-reaching consequences for climate, agriculture, and human survival. Understanding such past events enriches our perspective on current and future challenges related to climate change, volcanic risk, and food security. The story of mass starvation in Iceland when Volcano met Ice Age is a vivid reminder that the forces of nature can strike swiftly and mercilessly, upending lives, reshaping landscapes, and testing the limits of human resilience in the cold grip of history. Funeral bells froze and couldn't ring for the dead. In the bitter heart of Germany's harshest winters, an eerie silence fell not just over the snow-covered landscapes, but deep into the very rituals of life and death. During the coldest periods, such as the infamous winters of the Little Ice Age, funeral bells, once the mournful heralds of passing souls, froze solid, silenced by the relentless grip of ice and frost. This chilling reality turned age-old customs upside down and left entire villages to bury their dead in an unsettling quiet beneath frozen, unyielding earth. Funeral bells held profound significance in German communities. Their tolling was a vital ritual, a sound that traveled across hills and valleys to announce death, summon mourners, and mark the passage of the departed from life to afterlife. The bell's mournful chime was a communal call to grieve, to honor, and to confront mortality together. But when winter's harshest breath gripped the land, the very metal of these bells succumbed to freezing temperatures, becoming rigid and cracked, incapable of producing their familiar solemn tones. The cold didn't stop there. The ground itself hardened under layers of ice and frost, turning burial into a brutal challenge. Digging graves in frozen earth was nearly impossible, often requiring days of backbreaking labor. In some villages, the earth was so hard that coffins had to be temporarily stored above ground or in makeshift shelters until spring thawed the soil enough for burial. Families were forced to delay farewells or conduct hurried, improvised ceremonies. This silence, the absence of the funeral bell's call, cast a heavy shadow over communities. Without the sound to unite them in mourning, grief became a quieter, more isolated experience. The usual gathering of neighbors and relatives was sometimes replaced by solitary farewells, a loss not just of loved ones, but of shared ritual and comfort. The ringing bell that linked the living and the dead was muffled by ice, leaving villages to confront death in a frozen stillness that deepened sorrow and loneliness. Historical accounts from the coldest winters describe how some villages adapted with alternative rituals. Candles were lit in windows to signal a death, and mourners gathered silently, shrouded in layers of heavy clothing and frostbite. Yet these acts could never fully replace the powerful resonance of a funeral bell echoing through the crisp air. The great frosts and harsh winters of this era reveal how even the most sacred human customs are vulnerable to the whims of nature. When the bells fell silent and the ground hardened, the cycle of life and death was disrupted in ways that left lasting marks on collective memory. These frozen funerals speak to the resilience and sorrow of communities caught between the inevitability of death and the mercilessness of a frozen world. They remind us that climate's reach extends beyond crops and survival. It touches the very heart of human experience, silencing even the most sacred calls to mourn. Frostbitten soldiers died in masses on the battlefield, the 30 Years' War, raging across Europe from 1618 to 1648. Was among the most devastating conflicts in early modern history. A brutal struggle marked not only by fierce battles, but by unimaginable suffering and hardship. While gunfire, sieges, and sword clashes have long dominated the stories of this era, a chilling and often overlooked killer lurked in the shadows of those bloody fields: winter itself. Across the war's theaters, freezing temperatures wrought havoc on armies, often claiming more lives than bullets or blades. Among the most harrowing instances was the tragic fate of a Swedish unit in 1634, which lost an astonishing 70% of its men overnight, not to enemy assault, but to the merciless grip of frostbite. To grasp the full magnitude of this tragedy, it is vital to appreciate the broader context of warfare in early 17th century Europe. Armies were large but logistically fragile, dependent on limited supplies, inadequate shelter, and primitive medical care. Soldiers marched across rugged landscapes, often ill-equipped for the harsh seasons, enduring long campaigns that strained both body and spirit. Winter posed an existential threat. Freezing temperatures, snow, and biting winds were enemies as deadly as the opposing armies. The Swedish forces were renowned for their discipline and military innovations under King Gustavus Adolphus. Yet even their well-trained soldiers were vulnerable to the elements. The winter of 1634 proved especially cruel. On a bitterly cold night, temperatures plummeted to dangerous lows, and a particular unit, already weakened by exhaustion, hunger, and previous skirmishes, was caught exposed without adequate shelter or clothing. Frostbite, a condition where skin and underlying tissues freeze due to prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures, became a silent executioner. Limbs turned numb and blue, tissues hardened and died, and pain gave way to chilling numbness. For soldiers standing guard or bivouacked outdoors, the onset of frostbite could be swift and devastating. In the darkness and cold, many simply succumbed to hypothermia, their bodies shutting down as the frost claimed them. The reported loss of 70% of the Swedish unit in one night is staggering, more than two-thirds of the men falling victim to cold before the enemy even engaged. This catastrophic event underscores the brutal reality that in early modern warfare, nature was a formidable adversary. The freezing night not only decimated the unit, but demoralized survivors and commanders, weakening Sweden's military effectiveness during a crucial phase of the war. Such tragedies were not isolated. Across the battlefields of the 30 Years' War, freezing winters repeatedly claimed thousands of lives. Armies often camped in open fields with limited wood for fires and inadequate clothing. Supply lines were strained, making it impossible to provide proper winter gear. Soldiers, many peasants conscripted into service, faced harsh conditions that compounded the horrors of battle with the cruelty of nature. Medical knowledge of the time was limited. Treatments for frostbite and hypothermia were rudimentary at best. Amputations were common, but carried high risks of infection and death. The suffering endured by frostbitten soldiers was immense: pain, gangrene, and the slow, agonizing loss of limbs and life. Many succumbed not on the battlefield but in makeshift camps and field hospitals, abandoned by circumstance and the limits of contemporary medicine. The strategic impact of winter losses during the 30 Years' War was significant. Commanders had to plan campaigns around seasons, and winter quarters were fraught with danger. Armies were sometimes forced to withdraw or delay offensives to survive the cold. The war's ebb and flow were as much determined by weather as by military tactics. Historical accounts and letters from soldiers convey the human toll behind the numbers. Men wrote of comrades frozen stiff, of nights spent shivering in the dark, of the despair that came with watching friends perish to cold. The psychological burden was immense. Soldiers fought enemies they could see, but also battled the invisible, deadly chill. Reflecting on the 1634 Frostbite Massacre reveals the intersection of human vulnerability and nature's unforgiving power. It highlights how environmental factors have shaped warfare outcomes throughout history, often tipping the balance more decisively than swords or guns. This episode serves as a solemn reminder that survival in war depends not only on martial skill, but on endurance against the elements. Today, the story of the Swedish soldiers lost to frostbite invites us to remember those forgotten casualties of war, those who died silently in the cold, their sacrifice overshadowed by battles and politics. It underscores the necessity of preparation, adaptation, and respect for nature's might in all human endeavors. In the frozen fields of 1634, where frostbite claimed more lives than enemy fire, we witness a haunting testament to the relentless struggle of soldiers against not only human foes, but the merciless forces of climate and circumstance. This tragedy remains etched in history as a chilling example of nature's role as an unyielding and often deadly participant in the theater of war. Lakes swallowed horses and sleighs. When ice broke unexpectedly, the winters of 17th century Poland were harsh and unpredictable, marked by the extended cold of the Little Ice Age, a period that gripped much of Europe with plummeting temperatures and prolonged winters. Among the many challenges this brutal climate imposed on society was the use of frozen lakes and rivers as vital pathways during the snowy months. These frozen expanses often provided the quickest, sometimes the only routes connecting towns and estates when roads were choked with snow and mud. But beneath their beautiful glassy surfaces lay hidden dangers, fragile ice that could crack without warning, swallowing the unwary into frigid waters. One of the most tragic examples of this peril occurred in 1645, when a noble party crossing a frozen Polish lake suffered a catastrophic accident that claimed their lives and those of their horses, etched forever into the annals of local history. To understand the gravity of this event, it is important to situate it within the broader context of 17th century Poland and its climatic challenges. The country's landscape is rich with lakes, rivers, and wetlands, which formed essential routes for communication and trade. In winter, when snow blanketed the land and conventional roads became impassable, frozen waterways often served as natural highways. These ice-covered lakes enabled travelers to bypass muddy or snowbound paths, cutting travel time significantly and connecting remote areas that otherwise faced isolation. The nobility, who depended on swift movement to manage their estates, attend courts, or engage in politics, frequently used horse-drawn sleighs to traverse these frozen surfaces in relative speed and comfort. However, the frozen lakes were unpredictable and treacherous. The ice's thickness could vary dramatically due to underwater currents, temperature fluctuations, and the lake's depth. The presence of springs or inflowing rivers often created weak spots where ice would thin or crack. Even a well-frozen surface could suddenly fail under the combined weight of horses, sleighs, and passengers. While local communities accumulated practical knowledge about judging ice safety, testing thickness by tapping, observing color changes, or measuring temperature, there was never a guarantee. The pressure of necessity often forced travelers to take risks, especially in the depths of winter when supplies and time were limited. The incident recorded in 1645 is a stark and tragic illustration of these dangers. A group of nobles traveling together by sleigh across one of Poland's frozen lakes placed their trust in the solid-looking ice beneath their horses' hooves and the sleigh's runners. In the midst of their journey, the ice suddenly fractured, a terrifying, thunderous crack echoing across the frozen expanse. Before anyone could react, the ice gave way beneath the weight of the horses and sleigh, plunging them all into the icy, dark waters below. The freezing temperature of the water meant survival was nearly impossible. Hypothermia would set in within minutes, and the powerful currents beneath the surface pulled victims under, drowning them quickly. Rescue attempts, if any were possible, arrived too late. This event carried profound implications far beyond the immediate loss of life. Horses were not merely transportation. They were valuable assets vital for agriculture, military purposes, and maintaining noble households. Sleighs themselves were symbols of status and means of travel, often elaborately decorated and essential for winter movement. The sudden loss of a team of horses and the noble travelers disrupted local social and economic networks. Families grieved, political connections were affected, and the community was reminded starkly of the fragility of life in an unforgiving environment. Such tragedies were not isolated in 17th century Poland or across Europe. Throughout the Little Ice Age, similar stories emerged from the frozen lakes of Scandinavia, Russia, and Central Europe. The very features that made these frozen waterways valuable as winter routes also made them dangerous. Across the continent, ice that supported markets, festivals, and travel could become lethal traps with a little warning. These incidents underscore the complex relationship between humans and their environment, a dynamic of adaptation, opportunity, and risk. The 1645 incident also highlights the socio-cultural dimensions of winter travel during this era. The nobility's use of frozen lakes for sleigh travel reflected both privilege and vulnerability. While common folk might have been limited to shorter or more cautious journeys, nobles often undertook long trips for political or social obligations, placing them in harm's way. Their status could not shield them from nature's power, and their losses were felt widely. Chroniclers of the time, tasked with recording significant events, preserved such stories to caution others and to memorialize the fragility of human life against natural forces. Moreover, the tragedy reveals how knowledge about environmental hazards was intertwined with community practices and oral traditions. Locals developed keen senses for reading ice conditions, shared warnings, and established routes deemed safer. But even these customs were fallible. The pressures of winter's demands, harvest schedules, political duties, family needs sometimes pushed travelers to take risks they would otherwise avoid. The fine line between caution and necessity was constantly navigated. From a historical perspective, these dangers and the resulting tragedies influenced the development of travel practices and safety measures over time. Eventually, as road infrastructure improved and alternative routes were established, reliance on frozen lakes decreased. Later technological advances, like icebreakers and better weather forecasting, would further mitigate these risks. Yet, in the mid-17th century, such incidents were a grim reality of life in a world still deeply at the mercy of climate and nature. The story of the nobles drowned in 1645 is a haunting emblem of this era's harsh realities. It reminds us that beneath the serene and dazzling beauty of frozen winter landscapes lay latent hazards that could claim lives in an instant. The ice, both a path and a peril, was a stage where human endeavor met nature's indifferent might. It is a vivid historical lesson on vulnerability, adaptation, and the unpredictability of the natural world. As we reflect on this episode centuries later, it becomes clear that such tragedies were more than isolated accidents. They were woven into the fabric of early modern life. The frozen lakes of Poland and beyond were arenas of survival, commerce, leisure, and loss. They shaped community memories, influenced social customs, and underscored the precarious balance between human ambition and environmental forces. In closing, the frozen lake tragedy of 1645 calls us to consider the interplay of climate, society, and human courage. It stands as a poignant chapter in the history of winter travel, where frozen beauty met deadly danger, and where lives and livelihoods could be swallowed whole in the icy depths beneath a cracked surface. People burned books and furniture to survive the cold. In the bitterest winters of the Little Ice Age, when the merciless cold descended across Europe, the desperation of ordinary people knew no bounds. Cities like Prague and Munich, centers of culture, learning, and tradition, became stages for scenes of tragic survival that starkly contrasted with their rich histories. As relentless frost and biting winds gnawed through walls and windows, families faced a cruel dilemma: warmth or heritage, survival or memory. With forests stripped bare from decades of overharvesting, the precious supply of firewood dwindled to near nothing. To keep even a single room warm through the long, frozen nights, people were forced to turn to their last remaining resources, and those were often the very belongings that gave their lives meaning. The streets outside were a frozen wasteland, devoid of the branches and logs that once fueled hearths. The once lush woods that surrounded these cities had been felled to exhaustion, victims of human need and nature's relentless cold. Without wood, the fires that had warmed homes for centuries began to die down, leaving homes chilling to unbearable cold. The thin walls of tenement houses and cramped apartments offered little shelter. The biting air crept through every crack, and families huddled together, shivering under threadbare blankets and worn clothes. But blankets could only do so much when the air itself seemed to freeze solid. In this desperate fight against freezing nights, people began burning what they once treasured most. Heirlooms passed down through generations, carved wooden chests, finely crafted tables, and beloved chairs were dragged to the hearth and sacrificed to the flame. These were not mere objects. They were symbols of family history, pride, and identity. The crackle of burning wood carried the weight of loss as each splintered chair and mantelpiece turned to ash. Even more heartrending was the burning of books, repositories of knowledge, culture, and imagination. Libraries and private collections were stripped bare, their pages torn and fed into the fire as if they were kindling. The smell of scorched paper mixed with smoke filled the freezing air, a bitter reminder that survival trumped all else. It was a tragic irony that knowledge, meant to illuminate minds, was consumed in flames to save bodies from the cold. Entire beds were dismantled and burned to keep a family's room warm through a single harsh night. The mattresses, bed frames, and wooden slats, once the places where children dreamed and couples rested, became fuel. Parents faced agonizing decisions, weighing the temporary warmth against the long-term cost of losing the comfort and security their homes once provided. For many, the choice was made under the shadow of starvation and frostbite, where no alternative remained. This destruction of the household's physical and cultural fabric was not limited to Prague or Munich. Across Central Europe, the cold winters pushed communities to the brink, and these acts of sacrificial burning echoed in cities and villages alike. The loss of furniture and books was a slow erasure of heritage, a price paid in ash and soot to stave off death. Contemporary accounts reveal the haunting realities of these winters. Diaries speak of families gathered around meager fires, clutching what remained of their homes as flames consumed the familiar. Local officials and clergy documented the heartbreaking rise in poverty and despair, noting how the cold deepened social divides and fueled unrest. The inability to heat homes led not only to physical suffering, but also to the breakdown of social cohesion as fear and desperation spread. The economic ripple effects were profound. Furniture makers and bookbinders saw their crafts consumed rather than sold, cultural institutions faced empty shelves, and the markets for wood and fuel experienced chaotic surges. Attempts to ration firewood and impose regulations on its use often failed in the face of immediate human need. The psychological toll was immense. The burning of treasured belongings brought a crushing sense of loss and helplessness, compounding the physical hardships of the cold. Families mourned more than just warmth. They mourned a way of life fading away beneath the weight of ice and frost. Yet, within this bleak landscape, stories of resilience and adaptation emerged. Some families turned to alternative fuels, dried peat, agricultural waste, or even animal dung, though these substitutes were often less efficient and produced harsh smoke. Communities pooled resources when possible, sharing warmth and shelter in makeshift refuges. These acts of solidarity, while small, were vital threads of hope woven into the frozen fabric of suffering. The image of burning books and furniture stands as a powerful symbol of humanity's fragile struggle against nature's extremes. It speaks to the cost of survival when every resource is precious, and when the comforts of civilization can be sacrificed to preserve life itself. In those frozen nights in Prague, Munich, and beyond, fire was more than heat. It was a lifeline, a desperate beacon flickering against the cold dark. As modern viewers, reflecting on these harsh winters invites profound empathy and a deeper understanding of the intertwined fragility of culture and survival. The sacrifices made in those dark days remind us that beneath the veneer of history lies countless untold stories of endurance, loss, and the indomitable will to survive. Babies were born frozen or died before the morning came. In the remote rural corners of Ireland, during the harshest winters of centuries past, a silent tragedy unfolded. Babies were born only to freeze to death before the morning light could warm their fragile bodies. This heartbreaking reality was not the result of sudden storms or fleeting chills, but a grim consequence of living in stone cottages without heat, where cold nights turned into deadly traps for the most vulnerable among us, newborn infants. The midwives of these times, guardians of life and tradition, bore witness to the devastating pattern, recording with somber detail the heartbreaking loss of infants who could not survive the relentless cold. Life in rural Ireland was shaped by the landscape and the weather. Thick stone walls and thatched roofs, while sturdy against wind and rain, offered little insulation against freezing temperatures. Without chimneys or efficient heating, many families relied on small hearth fires that often went out overnight. As darkness fell and temperatures plummeted, the interior of these cottages became frigid, a perilous environment for anyone, especially newborns, whose tiny bodies lacked the ability to regulate heat. These infants, born into a world already harsh, faced a second invisible threat, the biting cold that crept silently into their beds. Midwives, the unsung heroines of rural Ireland, kept detailed accounts of these tragic nights. Their notes revealed that it was common for babies to be delivered safely during the day, only to perish before dawn. The cold was a killer that could not be fought by the warmth of a mother's embrace alone. Wrapping a newborn in layers of cloth was often not enough. The stone floors and walls sapped heat rapidly, chilling the air to a level that the most delicate lives could not endure. In many cases, infants were found still swaddled but lifeless, victims of hypothermia in a world that offered no shelter from the cold. This phenomenon was tragically widespread during particularly brutal winters, when ice and frost blanketed the countryside for months on end. The combination of harsh weather and inadequate living conditions created a deadly environment. Babies' deaths were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader tapestry of rural hardship and vulnerability. The loss rippled through families and communities, deepening grief and hardship in already difficult times. Beyond the immediate physical dangers, these deaths carried social and emotional consequences. Midwives often bore the heavy burden of grief alongside families, their roles extending beyond medical assistance to providing comfort and ritual in the face of loss. The frequency of such deaths heightened awareness of the brutal realities of rural life and underscored the urgent need for warmth and shelter, basic necessities often out of reach for the poorest. The stories of frozen infants in rural Ireland during cold winters highlight the intersection of environment, poverty, and human fragility. Without modern heating, insulated housing, or medical interventions, the natural world posed a constant threat. This reality was shaped by centuries of economic hardship, land struggles, and limited infrastructure that kept many families living in vulnerable conditions. The tragedy also reveals the critical role of midwives as both caregivers and chroniclers of history. Their records serve as haunting testimonies to lives lost and resilience endured. These midwives carried not only newborns into the world, but also the weight of witnessing lives snuffed out by cold, a sobering reminder of the precariousness of existence in past rural Ireland. In reflecting on these heartbreaking accounts, we are reminded of the vast improvements in healthcare, housing, and social support that have transformed infant mortality rates worldwide. Yet, the past casts a long shadow, reminding us of the essential human need for warmth, safety, and community care in the earliest moments of life. The frozen infants of rural Ireland are a silent, haunting chapter of history, one that speaks to the brutal realities faced by the most vulnerable and the enduring spirit of caregivers who stood at the edge of life and death, offering what comfort they could in the cold, dark nights of history. Frozen bread had to be chiseled apart with axes. In the bitter winter of 1740, the region of Flanders, an area known for its rich farmlands and bustling markets, faced a harsh and unforgiving reality. Bread, the staple of daily life, arrived frozen solid, unyielding, and cold as stone. This was no ordinary hardship. It was a symbol of how deeply the great frost had penetrated society, touching even the most essential element of survival. Families who relied on daily bread found themselves struggling to break through frozen loaves, resorting to metal tools like axes to carve away chunks of ice-hard sustenance, warming them with nothing more than their own breath and the flickering flame of a candle. Bread has always been the cornerstone of European diets, a symbol of life and community. In 18th century Flanders, it was both nourishment and comfort, baked fresh daily in village ovens and delivered by bakers to households and markets. But the winter of 1740 was different. An icy grip had seized the land for months on end. Sub-zero temperatures froze not just the rivers and fields, but the very loaves meant to feed millions. When the bread arrived, it was no longer soft and warm. It was rock-hard, a solid block of frozen dough that defied knives and hands alike. This chilling reality forced families into desperate adaptations. In humble homes, the sight of frozen bread was met with a mixture of frustration and grim determination. The simple act of breaking bread, a symbol of sharing and sustenance, became a daily struggle. Knives bent uselessly against the icy crust. Instead, families turned to heavier metal tools, axes, hatchets, or chisels, repurposed from farm or workshop to hack at the frozen mass. The sound of metal striking bread echoed through cold kitchens, a harsh rhythm underscoring the severity of the season. Once pieces were chipped free, warming them posed another challenge. The frozen bread would not yield warmth easily. It required the gentle coaxing of breath or the fragile heat of a candle flame. Families cupped small pieces in their hands, breathing warm air to soften the crust. In the dim light, the glow of a candle flickered against frost-covered windows as mothers and children worked painstakingly to make the bread edible. The process was slow and painstaking, a stark reminder of scarcity and the daily battle against the cold. This hardship was more than an inconvenience. It reflected the broader crisis gripping Flanders and much of Europe. The Great Frost of 1740 devastated crops, froze waterways, and disrupted trade routes. Wheat fields, the source of bread flour, were buried under snow or killed by frost. The scarcity drove prices sky high, making bread unaffordable for many. Deliveries were irregular and meager, the frozen bread arriving late and often spoiled. Hunger gnawed at communities already weakened by cold and isolation. Historical records reveal the social and psychological toll this took. Bread, the basic foodstuff, was traditionally a shared commodity, associated with charity and social bonds. The frozen loaves and the difficulty of breaking them apart symbolized the fracture of these communal ties under extreme stress. Families who once gathered warmly around fresh bread now faced silent meals of rationed crumbs. Starvation lurked behind the frozen crust. The use of metal tools in domestic kitchens also illustrates the extraordinary lengths people went to survive. Tools normally reserved for woodcutting or labor were pressed into service for a humble yet vital task. This improvisation speaks to human resilience amid environmental catastrophe. It also highlights the primitive conditions many endured, living with scant resources and no modern conveniences. This episode of Frozen Bread in Flanders underscores how climate extremes ripple into daily life in ways we often overlook. The Great Frost was not only a story of weather, but a saga of endurance. It reshaped routines, forced new survival strategies, and tested the limits of human ingenuity. As you imagine those cold kitchens, families hacking away frozen bread by candlelight, warming it with breath. The reality comes alive, a moment frozen in time where simple necessities became heroic achievements. The sound of metal against bread, the faint glow of candles, the soft breath warming crusts. These details paint a vivid picture of hardship and hope. The winter of 1740 reminds us that survival is often defined by small battles, the breaking of frozen bread, the sharing of warmth, the refusal to surrender to despair. It was a brutal season that left scars in memory and history, but also revealed the strength of human spirit amid relentless cold. This frozen bread story invites reflection on how deeply connected we are to nature's rhythms. When those rhythms break, as in 1740, even the most basic needs become precarious. Yet, through this precariousness, the will to survive shines brightest. Remember the families of Flanders chipping away frozen loaves, breathing life into cold bread, holding on to warmth by candlelight. Their struggle is a timeless testament to endurance, a stark reminder that even in the harshest winters, life finds a way to persist. Disease exploded in winter shelters, where hundreds hid from cold. In the harsh winters of early 17th century Europe, survival often meant retreating from the bitter cold into whatever shelter could be found. Yet these makeshift winter refuges, hastily constructed and overcrowded, became breeding grounds for an even deadlier enemy: disease. As families and entire communities huddled together to escape freezing temperatures, they unwittingly sealed their fate against invisible pathogens that spread swiftly and mercilessly. Nowhere was this tragedy more starkly evident than in Venice in 1631, where a devastating influenza outbreak claimed more lives than the winter's cold itself. To fully understand this catastrophe, we must first consider the dire conditions that drove so many into these crowded shelters. The early 1600s were marked by the lingering effects of the Little Ice Age, a period of significant climatic cooling that wreaked havoc on agriculture and food supplies across Europe. Bitter winters grew longer and more severe, crops failed with alarming regularity, and famine became a relentless threat. In response, people sought refuge wherever they could: barns, cellars, abandoned buildings, or hastily assembled huts, to shield themselves from frostbite, starvation, and exposure. However, these winter shelters, while a temporary refuge from the cold, were ill-equipped to protect their occupants from other dangers. Overcrowding was common. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of families squeezed into tight spaces with poor ventilation and minimal sanitation. These conditions were perfect for the rapid transmission of airborne illnesses and infectious diseases. The close proximity of bodies, the sharing of limited resources, and the lack of clean water and waste disposal created an environment ripe for outbreaks. Venice, a bustling and densely populated city-state reliant on trade and commerce, was no stranger to the challenges of winter survival. In the winter of 1631, as freezing temperatures gripped the region, many sought shelter in cramped quarters. It was here that influenza, an acute respiratory illness, took hold with devastating efficiency. The virus spread like wildfire through the packed shelters, cutting down the young and old, the healthy and the frail alike. Historical records reveal that the influenza outbreak in Venice that year killed more people than the cold. This grim fact illustrates the lethal synergy between environmental hardship and public health crises. While frostbite and hypothermia were visible threats, disease was the silent killer, striking swiftly and invisibly, overwhelming communities already weakened by hunger and exposure. The influenza epidemic of 1631 was not isolated. Across Europe during the Little Ice Age, winter disease outbreaks were a recurring scourge. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, typhus, and dysentery joined influenza in claiming lives. In the crowded winter shelters, these illnesses thrived. Medical knowledge was limited, and effective treatments were virtually non-existent. Physicians could do little beyond offer palliative care, and containment measures were poorly understood, allowing diseases to ravage populations unchecked. The impact on social structures was profound. Entire families were decimated, labor forces diminished, and economies strained under the weight of illness and death. The psychological toll was immense. Fear of disease compounded the terror of winter, breeding despair and hopelessness. Communities that might have survived the cold alone were undone by the invisible enemy within their refuges. Sanitation practices of the time, though rudimentary, were impossible to maintain in such overcrowded conditions. Waste accumulated, water sources became contaminated, and malnutrition weakened immune systems. These factors combined to create a perfect storm of public health disaster. Venice's experience in 1631 underscores the complex interplay between environment, human behavior, and disease. It highlights how survival strategies, when born of necessity and desperation, can inadvertently magnify risks. The story of these winter shelters is a poignant chapter in the history of epidemics, revealing how vulnerability can be exacerbated by the very actions taken to escape harm. Looking back, this tragedy offers critical lessons. It reminds us of the importance of adequate shelter, hygiene, and disease prevention measures, principles that remain vital today. The influenza outbreak of 1631 was a devastating consequence of environmental stress, coupled with insufficient public health infrastructure, a dynamic still relevant in contemporary global health challenges. In the cold, dark winter of 1631 Venice, the people's search for warmth and safety ironically brought them closer to death. The flu outbreak ravaged their ranks with a ferocity that outmatched even the freezing temperatures outside. Their suffering speaks to the fragile balance between human resilience and the forces of nature and disease, a balance that continues to shape the human story across centuries. As we remember those lost in Venice's winter shelters, we honor not only their endurance in the face of cold, but also the countless lives claimed by epidemics hidden within the walls meant to protect. Their story is a solemn reminder of the intertwined dangers of climate and contagion and the profound challenges faced by those seeking shelter from the storm. Spring floods drown towns. After harsh ice melt, the cycle of winter's harsh grip and spring's thaw has always been a defining force in shaping the landscapes and lives of Europe's river valleys. During the 15th century, the chilling winters of the Little Ice Age brought relentless ice and snow, which cloaked vast stretches of the continent in frozen stillness. Yet the very force that held life in icy suspension for months also harbored a devastating danger when it finally released its grip. The thaw that followed these intense winters unleashed torrents of melting snow and ice, causing catastrophic floods that reshaped entire regions overnight. One of the most harrowing episodes of this natural fury occurred in 1432, when the Danube River surged beyond its banks in Austria, drowning whole towns and leaving a trail of destruction that echoed through history. The Danube, Europe's second-longest river, has long been both a vital artery for commerce and a source of sustenance for communities along its banks. Its floodplains nurtured fertile soils for agriculture, while its waters connected cities and trade routes stretching across Central and Eastern Europe. However, this powerful river was also prone to seasonal floods, a natural phenomenon exacerbated during periods of climatic upheaval. The Little Ice Age brought especially harsh winters that accumulated thick layers of snow and extended ice cover over rivers and tributaries. These icy layers trapped vast quantities of water in frozen form, storing immense hydrological potential beneath the frozen surface. When spring arrived in 1432, the transition from frozen stillness to flowing abundance was anything but gentle. Rising temperatures caused rapid melting of snowfields and ice dams that had formed along the Danube and its feeder streams. This sudden influx overwhelmed the river's capacity, causing it to swell to unprecedented levels. The water breached levees and barriers, transforming tranquil waterways into raging currents. Towns nestled along the Danube's banks, many built with centuries of tradition and history, found themselves vulnerable to the river's unchecked power. Historical records vividly describe how entire Austrian towns were submerged in the floodwaters. Streets became rivers, homes collapsed under the pressure of rising water, and farmlands turned to swamps. The speed and scale of the flooding were such that residents had little time to evacuate. Many were caught unprepared by the sheer force of the deluge, leading to tragic loss of life and displacement. These floods were not isolated to one community, but swept across the region, altering the social and economic fabric of the affected areas. The devastation wrought by the 1432 Danube flood had long-lasting consequences. Economically, the destruction of homes, granaries, and fields disrupted food supplies and trade. Infrastructure essential for communication and commerce, such as bridges and roads, was damaged or destroyed, further isolating communities during a critical recovery period. Socially, the displacement of populations led to migrations, shifts in settlement patterns, and sometimes conflict over remaining resources. The psychological impact of witnessing one's town vanish beneath floodwaters left a mark on collective memory, influencing local lore and historical accounts for generations. This flood also serves as a stark example of the complex relationship between climate and human societies in the pre-modern era. The very winters that sustained populations by preserving water in frozen reservoirs became agents of destruction when their thaw released pent-up energy. Communities depended heavily on rivers for their livelihoods, yet lived in constant negotiation with their unpredictable moods. Flood management was rudimentary at best. Levees and dikes were often insufficient to withstand such extraordinary events. The 1432 flood likely spurred efforts to better control river flows, encouraging the development of early hydraulic engineering and community cooperation in flood defenses. In examining the 1432 Danube flood, we also gain insight into the broader climatic patterns of the Little Ice Age. This period was characterized not only by colder temperatures, but also by increased climatic variability, extremes of cold, heavy snowfall, and sudden warm spells. Such volatility meant that communities had to be resilient and adaptable, coping with repeated environmental shocks. The flood illustrates how natural systems can accumulate risk over time, with a buildup of winter ice and snow transforming into a springtime hazard capable of reshaping human geography. The legacy of this event resonates in how we understand the interplay of nature's power and human vulnerability. It reminds us that environmental forces, while often cyclical and predictable, can manifest in sudden and catastrophic ways. The story of the 1432 Danube flood challenges the notion of human dominance over nature, revealing instead a delicate balance where survival depends on respect, preparedness, and adaptability. Today, the towns along the Danube are fortified with modern flood defenses, advanced warning systems, and sophisticated river management strategies, tools unimaginable to those who lived through the medieval deluge. Yet the memory of such floods persists, a sobering reminder that even great rivers can turn into agents of destruction. The story of the spring floods that drowned Austrian towns in 1432 is not just a historical footnote. It is a powerful testament to the enduring dialogue between humanity and the natural world, where every thaw carries the potential for renewal and ruin. In reflecting on this chapter of history, we see the profound impact of climate on the trajectory of human settlement, economy, and culture. The 1432 flood was a crucible that tested resilience and reshaped communities. It stands as a compelling example of how the forces unleashed by the breaking ice, so often a symbol of winter's end and new beginnings, can also bring unforeseen devastation, altering lives and landscapes in an instant.